Welcome to Rock the Diploma's Part A Written Response Overview session. In this particular session, we're going to sort of have an overview and a breakdown of Part A. We're going to take an initial look at personal responses and critical analytical responses. We'll take a very sad look at insufficient responses and what they sort of look like. We'll take a peek at topics and look at some ways to kind of break down the key to these topics. And there will also be some practice assignments that you'll be able to take a look at a little bit later on when you feel prepared for that. So to follow along in your hard copies, you're going to want to have Booklet 2, which says Part A Written Response. So the Part A for the ELA 30-1 diploma exam is the written response, and it's worth 50% of the total examination mark. And there are two components to it. First of all, you will see there's a personal response to texts, and there is a critical analytical response to literary texts. Now, something that differs with the Part A written response is what you're allowed to bring in with you. You can still bring in, of course, a pencil and a pen and a highlighter, and with those you can put down jot notes, you can highlight stuff, you can make annotations, especially for the personal response prompting texts. But you can also bring in with you an English or a bilingual dictionary. You can bring in a thesaurus, and I would highly recommend that you bring in both of those so that you can take a peek at the topic and ensure that you fully understand it, because if you don't understand some of the keywords in the topics for some reason, nobody in that room is going to be able to help you out. And if you don't know the question, how can you answer it? You are also allowed to bring in with you an authorized writing handbook. And you can see here that we've got a whole list of them. There are only 7 writing handbooks that you are allowed to have. Now, if you're sitting there and you're like, what? I've never heard this. I've never used these before. What's the deal? Is somebody getting a leg up on me? No, that's not the case. Some schools, some teachers like to use these as part of the writing process. Now, if you haven't used one of these before, now is not the time to run out and grab one of those and try to use it. It'll be a useless tool for you. It's just, if you have been using one of them, ensure that it is one of these specific editions for these handbooks, and you are allowed to bring that in with you. So the first assignment in the Part A written response is the personal response to texts. And this requires students to explore a given thematic topic in response to 3 provided prompting texts. It will include a visual, could be a combination of visuals, but it's been years since that's happened. And there will be a prose excerpt, which will be an excerpt from a novel. It could be fiction or nonfiction, and there will also be a poem. Now, this assignment is designed to be completed in approximately 45 to 60 minutes, although bear in mind everybody gets the extra time, the double time from Alberta Education. So if you want to build that in, that's the 90 to 120 minutes for this assignment, although you have 6 hours for the entire Part A, so decide how you want to divvy up that time. Nobody's going to stop you with the personal response after just 2 hours. Now, it's also designed to provide students with the opportunity to use a prose form of their choice. So you can decide whether you want to write a short story or journal entries or an essay or whatever. It's up to you. Now, of course, you're choosing that prose form. You're responsible for actually effectively communicating in that chose form because you made that choice. But you do this to create a personal response that will convey your idea as prompted by the reading of one or more of the prompting texts. It's also designed to encourage the expression of student voice, and we'll be talking more about voice a little bit later, and voice is absolutely key in these responses, with an awareness of the intended audiences of the prose forms that students have chosen, and also to introduce students to the thematic context of the critical analytical response to literature, because the topics will be quite similar. So the critical analytical topic will have like an extra keyword or some sort of qualifying term thrown in there that will sort of narrow the focus a little bit, but they will be similar. Now, you're expected to write a developed response that will reflect the quality of logical thought and effective presentation that is expected of someone who is graduating from ELA 30-1. This assignment is worth 20% of the total examination mark. It's 20, the critical's 30, so that's the total of 50 for the Part A. And you are scored in 2 areas. There are ideas and impressions, and that is worth 10% of the total examination marks, so that's half of the personal response rubric, and the other half of the personal response rubric is presentation. We're going to look at that in a little bit more detail in the next session. Now, the one area of the rubric that we will address here in this particular session is the insufficient or INS response, because I guess we like to front load with bad news here. So a response that is assigned insufficient is given 0% in both scoring categories, both the ideas and impressions as well as presentation. So you get a 0 for the entire personal response. Now it's a special category, is how they refer to it, because it is not an indicator of quality. You could write an absolutely gorgeous short story, but if you do some of these things here below, you can still get 0. So how does this happen? Now, if you respond using a form other than prose, which essentially means you're told you can write any type of response other than a poem, and you're like, gonna write a sonnet, you'll get a 0. Okay? If you've written so little that it is not possible to assess ideas and impressions, then you'll also get an INS. Now that means like you write a single paragraph for your personal response, you're probably getting a 0. You've got 6 hours to write 2 assignments. I mean, come on. There's no evidence that the topic presented in the assignment has been addressed, so you're asked a question and you choose not to answer the question at all, you get a 0. There's no connection between one of the prompting texts and your response. You do have to connect to a prompting text in some way. We'll talk more about that in detail a little later on, but if you don't do that, again, INS. And then finally, there's no evidence of an attempt to fulfill the task presented in the assignment, meaning you chose just not to do anything. You don't hand anything in. Either way, any of those things happen, you'll be in sad town. Now, just quickly switching gears ever so briefly to talk about the critical analytical response. This assignment requires you to relate literature that you have studied in English 30-1 to the thematic context introduced in the personal response to texts assignment. That's a fancy way of saying, hey, you're going to have a slightly different topic than you saw in the personal response, and you have to address this using something that you studied in class. A text that you know, it's in your brain, you know a lot about it, and you are walking into that exam without having the text in front of you. It's just in your head. Kind of like a fancy content exam, really, if you think about it. And the critical analytical sets a specific writing task that requires you to choose a relevant literary text. This has a little S in brackets. Never write on more than one, okay? If you want to do anything better than a satisfactory on this, only ever pick a single text. And to be able to provide appropriate support, which could be details, examples, illustrations, whatever, from that text, and to select an effective method of development, which means like a logical, structured argument. The specific topic prompt for the critical analytical will not be identical to that of the personal response. As I've mentioned, it will be very similar, but not identical. You should be choosing a text that you have studied in depth in class. The idea behind that is that it's a text that, first of all, should be a rich, quality text, and you should know it really well. You will have been able to research this. You will have listened to teachers' ideas on it, your peers' ideas, and you will have explored it at length. And this will give you the best opportunity to demonstrate insight and skillful analysis. Now, when you're planning your response, there is a page that says the personal reflection on choice of literary texts. This section allows you to explore your reasons for choosing a particular text in order to clarify your ideas prior to beginning the critical analytical. We're going to see this on another slide here, and I think I'll be able to just show you a little bit better how to handle that. Now, in better responses, it's evident that students have deliberately chosen the text, okay, and support that reinforces their ideas in relation to that topic. Meaning you picked a text because you know it really well and it works well for the topic. So of course, those responses are going to be better. Students are encouraged to write about literary texts that they understand and that they enjoy. Now, every time I say that, I sort of chuckle to myself because I know that there are some students out there, and maybe you're among them, who hate everything that you studied in class. So take that whole enjoyment thing with a little grain of salt. Ideally, you would enjoy the text that you're going to write about, because if you enjoy it, you probably know it that much better. You're more passionate about it, and you have all those details in your brain. Now, the best way that you can help prepare for the diploma exam is to learn strategies that assist you with the development of strong reading and writing skills, and hopefully these sessions will assist you with that. Now, the critical analytical assignment is designed to be completed in approximately 1.5 to 2 hours. Okay, but bear in mind, of course, everybody has that double time from Alberta Education, so you could consider that 3 to 4 hours. And if you do take the 4 hours on that, plus the 2 hours on the personal response, that is that total of 6. But again, you can choose how you want to divvy up that time. It's designed to assess your response to a thematic topic. You're presented with a topic and you're going to create an argument based on that. You're being assessed on the quality of your knowledge and understanding of literary text. So again, that content idea, as well as your ability to employ, develop, and synthesize how you're incorporating your details from the texts as support for your idea. And to assess students' ability to use an appropriate form and structure to focus and shape their discussions using effective and correct language choices. So this appropriate form and structure, this is this formal, third-person, authoritative sounding, structured essay, okay? And then also being able to employ the English language effectively to communicate your ideas. So when responding to the critical analytical response topic, you have the opportunity to reveal your understanding of a writer's craft and your interpretations of a text that you have chosen to discuss, and to demonstrate how well you can express your ideas in first draft writing. Now, this whole thing about the discussing a writer's craft and whatnot, you don't really want to go ahead and spend any time discussing like the symbolism of the Elroy character in On the Rainy River unless it's relevant to your discussion. But if it is, you can absolutely go ahead and talk about that. Markers are interested in learning what you actually think and believe, and that means that formulaic approaches to writing, maybe you practiced, I have a critical analytical response in my brain and I always write the same thing, I just kind of switch out the topic keywords, that it comes across as very robotic and forced, unless by some fluke the topic that you tend to have written very frequently on is similar enough to the one that you get on diploma day. Don't bank on that though, okay? And that sort of formulaic approach will impede your ability to express ideas clearly or to create a truly authentic voice. The value of the critical analytical is 30% of the total examination marks. So again, it means that it's 1.5 times the value of the personal response, and that's part of the reason why they're suggesting that you spend more time on it. They also tend to be longer than the personal responses on average. Now for scoring as a marker, I really prefer marking the personal responses because you have the 2 categories. We've got 5 for the critical analytical response. So first of all, there's thought and understanding, there's supporting evidence, and those 2 out of the 5 actually occupy half of the mark there. You can see that they're weighted 7.5%, whereas the following 3 categories are weighted 5. You've got form and structure, there's matters of choice, and matters of correctness. And we will be diving deeper into this rubric later on. So just like with the personal response rubric, I'm going to front load you here with the bad news of INS. Now, compositions that refer only to a prompting text in the personal response assignment, or you just don't do the critical analytical response, they will receive insufficient. And if you are marked as INS, it's a 0 in all 5 of those scoring items, just like with the personal response, it's a straight up 0. Now, Alberta Ed refers to this as a special category, and it's not an indicator of quality. You might be an amazing writer, but if you do one of these things here, sadly, you can expect a 0. So that will happen if you've written so little that we can't assess thought and understanding or supporting evidence. So again, it's probably that like single paragraph sort of idea. That doesn't work, okay? No reference has been made to literature. So if you write like a personal experience or some sort of philosophical discussion about the universe, again, that will be insufficient. If the only literary reference to any sort of text is a prompting text from the personal response, again, you'll get insufficient. I'm going to quickly stop. Never write on the prompting text. Never write on the prompting text in the personal response for your critical. It's a complete waste of your time. Only write about something from outside of that examination. And finally, if there's no evidence of an attempt to fulfill the task, which I just mentioned there. So if you don't do anything, you don't hand it in, you can expect the insufficient. And once again, that takes you to sad town. So let's not do that. Now, while we're sort of mentioning the whole idea of texts, with the personal response, the only texts you should write about would be one of the prompting texts that are in the diploma examination booklet, either the poem, the prose excerpt, or the visual. You would not want to discuss a text that you studied in class or a movie you watched the other night or something like that. Again, if you're deciding to analyze a text or use that in your personal response, it should be one of the prompting texts. And I want to point out now the phrasing of the topic question. It always starts off with, what do these texts suggest about blah, 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 whatever your topic happens to be. And I just want to reinforce one more time with the critical analytical response, you only want to use literature from outside of the diploma exam. You can't write about any of the prompting texts for the personal response. Just really create that division in your mind there. And again, it should be something that you studied in class. I mean, technically you could realistically write on anything, but that's a huge danger zone, because if it's just a movie that you've watched a million times and you love it, it might not be that great of a piece of literature and there might not be a lot going on in it. B, you might have a weird interpretation or understanding of it. C, you might be lacking some details or something like that. And you will not have had that opportunity to really discuss with somebody who is familiar with the diploma exam details from that. You won't have written about it in class. You will not have practiced it. So that's why it's a huge danger zone. And Alberta Ed says, hey, you should be using something that you studied in class. Now, talking about the actual topic here again, it is always phrased as the following. Discuss the ideas developed by the text creator in your chosen text about whatever that topic happens to be. So you'll notice this next section here has examples of former diploma topics. And we go right back starting as of January 2000. And you can see here on this particular slide, it starts off with some rather simple topics here. We've got perseverance, we have adaptation, right? Pretty easy, just a single prong there is what we sort of refer to those keywords as. And then moving down to June of 2010, the ways in which individuals take responsibility for themselves or others. So it's definitely a more complicated topic. Now, the topics that you'll see on this page here are topics that you can use to practice. So for the critical analytical responses, you can use any of these and the ones on the next slides here as well to do that, because all you need is a topic and your own understanding of the text from class. So initially, the topics for the personal response and critical analytical response were identical until January 2014, where you see we've got them split up, the P and the C, that's personal and critical there, when they decided to actually take the critical topic and focus it just a little bit more. So January 2014, the personal topic was the impact significant events have on an individual's ability to determine their own destiny. Okay, so that's how significant events play into that. Whereas the critical is the role kindness plays when individuals attempt to determine their own destiny. So it's focused. It's not just significant events, right? It's kindness. So it's a little bit more focused. I also want to take this opportunity to mention that I find that the key to working with these topics is oftentimes in the first few words of the topic. You can sort of consider it almost like I need to find a variable and I need to work with a particular variable in order to take that straightforward, satisfactory idea and launch it up into the proficient, the 80%, or the excellent, the 100% range. So what does that look like? The conflict between pursuing a personal desire and choosing to conform. It isn't just whether somebody goes for a personal desire or chooses to conform. It's a conflict between. So that's almost kind of looking at that decision-making process and how that conflict is significant on somebody, right? looking at the impact of an individual's ambition on self and others. It's not just whether or not I have ambition, but what is the impact of that ambition on me, on other people. The human need to. So this is making a commitment or renouncing a course of action. All right, so this is not just whether or not I make a commitment or whether I turn away from something, but it's what's the motivating factor? What drives me to do that? The ways in which is a very common start to a topic that we see here over the years. And this is about individuals responding to the conflict between illusion and reality, but this is about the way in which. So how does somebody respond to that? And what is important about responding in that fashion? So if I respond to it in a particular way, somebody else could have responded to it in a different way, right? So why is it important that I went about it in a particular fashion or a character, right? And then also the interplay between is another very common beginning to a topic. And this is empathy and self-interest. These interplay topics, you always want to think about them as like gears. It's not just like cause and effect, but rather how are they sort of working together or against each other, influencing one another or whatever, and what's important about that influence. And then as you can see, as we hit some of these later topics here, 2017 through 2019, again, they are definitely more complex than looking back at 2000 or 2001. So just a reminder for any of the critical analytical practicing you'd like to do, I'd pick some of these later topics in order to do so because they are a lot more similar to what you can expect to see on your diploma exam. Now, speaking of practice, we've got a couple of full personal response assignments here in this booklet that you can use in order to practice and prepare for your diploma exam. So this first one here is from January 2013. So the first prompting text for this assignment is the poem Useless Boys. And I find this is a really good example of why I try to steer a lot of students away from a strictly analytical essay for their personal response, because this poem here is all about the speaker addressing like a childhood friend, mentioning how his father worked himself to death basically in a manual labor job that just sucked the life out of him. And when they were children, these two guys swore that they would never be like that, but essentially have taken on the white collar version of that sort of lifestyle. Now, at the very end here, you've got this very sarcastic couple of lines. Lucky us, useless boys found cures for all our dreams. And I found that when I was marking this particular session of the diploma exam back in 2013, several students, essays that I looked at personally, several students had gone ahead and misinterpreted that and didn't realize, they didn't pick up on the sarcasm, and they thought that this was actual instruction, that you should find a cure for your dream and just try to be realistic about stuff. But then they were hinging an analytical essay on a misinterpretation of a text. So it's a huge danger zone. The second prompting text for this personal response is a novel excerpt, and it is from the novel Cutting for Stone. And you know that this is always an excerpt because it has from in lowercase letters, and then Cutting for Stone is the novel's title. And as you can see, this is a 2-page novel excerpt. They tend to range between 2 to 3 pages in length, depending on the semester. Now, the third and final prompting text here is the visual, this piece of art entitled The Fall of Superman Near Bliss Street Station version 4. Now, you might have to look at it carefully before you actually find Superman falling, and he is off there in the corner. Now, this is an example of a visual where something that, like this title here, is drawing you towards that, because you see the fall of Superman is the first part of it. However, Superman is actually the least important element of this visual. We're going to look at visuals in the next session where we talk about looking at symbols and images and stuff like that, and how you can use those to write a personal essay or a personal narrative or a creative piece or something like that. But there are so many other parts of this visual that are really interesting and could be used. You've got this man standing here. His posture is a little odd. He's carrying a bag. You could relate this to like emotional baggage dragging a person down. You've got this rubble going on over here, which could be like things in a person's life cracking, crumbling, falling down. I recall people this semester engaged in a discussion of religious imagery. It was a way to sort of work towards a personal discussion of their own. They were looking at serpents here and talking about like the fall of humanity as brought out in the book of Genesis and the Bible. There are all kinds of things here. There's litter going around. Even just this whole, the way that this is laid out is a very strange, sort of surreal type of visual, and a person could even discuss surreality and being in a situation where you just felt like everything was weird and warped and twisted. You can pull these elements out of a visual or out of a poem or out of a prose excerpt and use that to get into a way to prompt you to talk about a personal discussion, but more on that later. So as you'll see with the personal responses, there's always a bit of a preamble that you've got here, which is really just a brief sentence about each of the three prompting texts. And then you've got the assignment, which is the topic. And again, what do these texts suggest to you about? It's always phrased that way. And this one here is the human need to make a commitment or renounce a course of action. I mentioned that one on a previous slide there. So again, this is about the motivating factors that drive people to make a commitment or renounce a course of action. You always have to be on the lookout for these or topics, because this is really two topics in one. It's either the human need to make a commitment or it's the human need to renounce a course of action. So when you've got that, you do not need to discuss both ends of that. I mean, on the one hand, you possibly could, perhaps in order to make a commitment to something, you do have to turn away from a previous course of action, but that's not a requirement for any of these or topics. You'll see the next page that follows the assignment page is always the planning, and you can see here the three areas that they ask you to address. First of all, to which of the provided texts are you responding? What is the connection between the texts and your response? So this is really simple. I'm responding to the visual, or you could even put the full title of it out, but you don't need to. You could write the poem, novel excerpt, visual, whatever. But what is relevant about it with regards to your response? That part is extremely important if you are writing a personal essay or personal narrative or a creative piece, something like that, that does not explicitly reference the prompting text. When we talk about personal essays and whatnot, I'll talk more about those implicit connections as opposed to explicit. But when you are only implicitly referencing the prompting text and not actually like in the visual, if that's not showing up in your response, you need to have this connection here, because that's how you avoid the insufficient. All right. The second part is, what idea about the prompting texts do you intend to explore and how does it address the topic? Essentially, I would just write down your idea here. What is your answer to the topic question? And then finally, state your choice of prose form. And then it's like, choose from prose forms that you have practiced, whatever. No. Write down, is it a personal essay? Is it a creative short story? Is it a series of character journal entries? Is it an analytical essay? Is it a personal analytical hybrid? Whatever, just write that down. That might be the least important part of the planning page. And if you're like, well, I don't know if this is a philosophical or a personal essay, don't worry. This planning page can never hurt you. It can only help you. This is one more way for us, the markers, to see what you're trying to do, help you avoid an insufficient, and to really understand your idea and what you're doing. And if there's something that maybe is a little unclear in the actual response, but by reading your planning page, I'm like, oh, that's what she was trying to do, or that's what he was trying to do, you'll get credit for that. So that's how this can help you out. So looking at the critical analytical assignment from the same semester here, you can see how it's laid out. Right off the bat, it tells you, do not use the prompting texts for the personal response. You can't do it right there. And then they say here, pick something that you've studied in class, essentially. And then we've got the assignment, and this, you can see how the topic differs. Discuss the ideas developed by the text creator in your chosen text about, again, always starts that way, the motivation to question or confirm a committed course of action. So it's similar, okay? But notice that this is about the motivation to, so this isn't quite the human need to, but this could be the motivation to, so it might be even talking about external influences or something like that, all right? And this is questioning or confirming a committed course of action. So questioning, I guess, might be kind of closer to renouncing that course of action, but it doesn't mean you have to renounce it. It might just be like a person having doubts or something like that, right? But again, we've got the or in here, so this is the motivation to question a committed course of action or the motivation to confirm a committed course of action. And here we've got the planning page for the critical analytical response. You'll see up at the top here, it asks you for the literary text and creator. That's where you would be like, I'm writing On the Rainy River by Tim O'Brien. Okay. I also want to point out here that on your diploma examination booklet, okay, on the back side of it, where you'll be putting on labels and stuff like that, you've got this section right here, okay, where it says, oh, my hand's over it, literary text. This is also where you should write down the text that you're going to use just for your critical analytical. Don't write down whatever prompting text you connected to or analyzed or whatever for the personal response, just the critical analytical response. And that's because when we are marking the criticals and during the marking session, this is how we quickly sort, because the people who mark, and it'll be at least 2 people who mark your critical analytical, are only teachers who actively teach that text. So as a marker, I need to sit there and like sort through and find ones that I'm actually qualified to mark. So that's a quick way that it helps your marker sort what we're able to mark. Now, you'll see this part here that says the personal reflection on choice of literary text. I dislike this section. It says, briefly explore your reasons for selecting the literary text as support for your response. Markers will consider the info you provide here when considering the effectiveness of your supporting evidence. Now, if I was writing a critical analytical and I saw this statement, briefly explore your reasons for selecting this text, I'd be like, well, I know it and it works for the topic. Those are the reasons, right? Are there any other reasons? I don't think so. Treat this as your planning page. This is where I would go ahead and put down your thesis statement or your controlling idea, maybe some point form evidence that you'll be using. You could write out a bit of a blueprint for your essay. You could write an entire full-blown essay outline because you have not just this page, but a couple of pages of lined paper that follow it. So you could do your full planning here. That's what you should be using that section for. Now next, we've got the second personal response, the full personal response, as well as the critical analytical topic. This is from January 2017. So again, this is something that you can also use to practice for your diploma. Now in the pages in your booklet, you'll see that we have the 3 prompting texts. There's the novel excerpt from the novel The Road Past Altamont. You've got the poem About My Father's Plot to Get Home, and you've got this visual, and you'll see that there's actually a little bit of a preamble about it where it says that this is a visual from a larger work of visuals, and it'll provide a little context for you. So definitely carefully read all of that. And then you'll see that we've got this topic. What do these texts suggest to you about the ways in which individuals deal with the prospect of an uncertain future? So always looking at those first few words, we've got the ways in which style of topic. So this is about how might somebody deal with the prospect of an uncertain future, and what is important about how somebody might go about that. If I approach it in a particular way, maybe it'll have certain results, whereas if I had gone about it in a different fashion, it might have turned out very differently, right? Also, be aware that you can always kind of manipulate some of the terms in the topic. In this case, uncertain future. What is that? Does that mean that you're uncertain about the future? Is the future uncertain? Is this the future 10 years from now, 20, 30 years from now? Is it next week? That's all the future. So you can always sort of bear those things in mind when you're trying to decide how to approach the topic. And then finally, we've got the critical analytical assignment for that semester. So as you can see here, this is about how imagination affects an individual's willingness to embrace or reject an uncertain future. So this is about how imagination plays into this willingness to embrace or willingness to reject. Again, we've got that or there. So this is, again, multiple topics in one. So this is, again, another topic you could certainly practice with. Well, that concludes our Part A overview. And coming up next, we've got personal responses, wherein we're going to be talking about actually writing personal responses, looking at how to create effective voice, depending on what you're trying to do and what type of text you're writing, looking at personal essays in depth because that's my favorite, and then also taking a little look at the rubric, everybody's favorite part. So yeah, I'll see you in the next session.